Welcome to Bible Fiber. I'm Shelley Neese, president of the Jerusalem Connection, a Christian organization devoted to sharing the story of the people of Israel, both ancient and modern. This week, we are continuing our study of the book of Ezra, diving into chapter 3. This portion of the narrative is full of victorious moments. The first wave of returnees from Babylon to Judah rebuilt an altar to the Lord, resumed their religious calendar of worship, and commenced work on the temple foundations. If chapter 2's theme was continuity within the community, chapter 3 stresses the continuity between the first and second temples. Chapter 3 begins, "When the 7th month came and the Israelites had settled in their towns, the people assembled together as one in Jerusalem. Their goal was to build the altar of the God of Israel to sacrifice burnt offerings on it." The passage conveys the remnant's feeling of urgency to rebuild the altar. For all this time in exile, they were deprived of sacrifice, which according to the Torah legislation also meant they were deprived of atonement. The narrator skips over the journey from Babylon to Judah and omits details about the process of resettlement, where the Israelites had to reclaim their long-abandoned property. Presumably, they are in the second year of being back in the covenanted land, around 536 BCE. As their primary objective, the returnees rebuild their altar to God and resume their original ways of worship. From the moment the community began work on the altar, they operated with unity of purpose. In their prioritization of building an altar upon entering the land, they mirrored the actions of Abraham and Joshua. Abraham's first order of business upon entering the Promised Land was setting up an altar. Joshua built an altar, per Moses' instructions, as soon as the people crossed the Jordan. A basic purpose to Israel's calling is worshiping their God, and that is evidenced in their priority of altar building. Rebuilding an altar was not difficult. Only field stones, undefiled by cutting tools, were allowed for the altar to the Lord. Presumably, uncut stones were easy to find in the rubble of Jerusalem's ruins. According to the biblical instructions, the altar also did not need to be large, only 5 cubits by 5 cubits. That's around 7 feet by 7 feet. A ramp to access the altar was the only required architectural flourish. The narrator emphasizes that work began on the 7th month. According to the Jewish liturgical calendar, the 7th month is packed with 3 nearly back-to-back high holidays: Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. It is safe to presume that the people were eager to resume their sacrificial system in some form, even without a temple, before the commencement of the high holiday season. They first reinstituted the morning and evening sacrifices. This was known as the tamid sacrifice, a twice-daily sacrifice of a 1-year-old lamb and grain offering. The lambs were laid on the altar, ensuring that the altar fire continuously burned both day and night. God promised the Israelites coming out of Egypt that if this burnt offering is to be made regularly at the entrance to the tent of meeting, God will certainly meet them there and speak with them, as the place will be consecrated by my glory. With the resumption of the daily burnt offerings and sacred fire, free will offerings were also renewed on the altar. While the burnt offerings represent the community's corporate commitment to God, free will offerings reflected individual repentance and atonement. For the first time in decades, the community observed the Festival of the Booths, also known as the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot. Sukkot is an annual reenactment of Israel's 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. According to the scriptures, the people are commanded to build temporary living structures and stay in them for 8 days, remembering their ancestors' complete reliance on God for daily provision and protection. For the returnees, after going through their own second exodus, deliverance from captivity in a foreign land, the message of Sukkot surely felt poignant. Interestingly, the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, is not mentioned as a holiday of note in the 7th month. One reason may be that while the traditions surrounding Sukkot were possible to enact without a temple, the priest could not conduct a Yom Kippur service without a Holy of Holies. The community made certain that they placed their altar atop the former site of the altar in the first temple. The returnees were paranoid about repeating the mistakes of their ancestors. At the top of their ancestors' list of offenses was their assumption that they could place altars to God on whatever high place suited them. Mount Moriah's sanctity reaches back to Abraham. This was the spot where Abraham nearly sacrificed his son Isaac before God intervened. Centuries later, atop Mount Moriah, King David bought the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. David built an altar to worship God there in gratitude for ending a deadly plague, sweeping the land. When Solomon built his massive temple for the Lord, he incorporated his father's threshing floor as the temple's altar site. During the 50 years of exile in Babylon, the local population that remained in Judah may have appropriated the altar site as their own place of worship. Ezra's narrator in passing commented, "They set up the altar on its foundation because they were in dread of the people of the lands." Their fears may have stemmed from their brazen reclamation of their altar site. Perhaps they had to tear down an altar used by the locals in their absence, and this act did not help ingratiate them with their neighbors. When they built the altar, they were careful to do so in accordance with what is written in the law of Moses. Notably, the post-exilic community possessed an authoritative written version of the Torah, and they were determined to continue with the same sacrificial system of worship prescribed to Moses and Aaron. Again and again in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, emphasis is placed on the community's conformity with the written scriptures, which apparently they had access to. When the people were attentive to detail, it was always based on their written scriptures. I find it fascinating that already at this stage, the Jews are the people of the book. Having an altar allowed the community to worship Yahweh and offer daily sacrifices, following the Torah's guidelines for proper worship. The temple was a longer-range goal and grander undertaking, requiring greater expertise and expense. When describing the reconstitution of the temple's foundations, the narrator of Ezra consciously includes descriptive parallels between Solomon's temple and the Second Temple. As a result, the reader is pushed to see the parallels as a sign of divine endorsement. Just as Solomon's temple project began in the second month of the year, so did the Second Temple. The returnees construct the Second Temple using the same building method and materials as Solomon's temple. Solomon imported cedars from Lebanon, having them transported to Jerusalem by Phoenicians. The post-exilic community followed the exact script of acquiring materials. Even the same skilled foreign workers are employed. Though 5 centuries separate the two temple projects, Tyre and Lebanon continued to provide a robust supply chain for labor and materials. Zerubbabel and Jeshua operated as co-leaders for the temple project. For more on Zerubbabel and Jeshua, listen to last week's episode on Ezra 2. The 4 priestly families and Levites listed in Ezra 2's Chronicle of Returnees supervised the temple work, making certain that the building process and the temple layout adhered to the laws of Moses. Though the narrator's description of the building process draws out the similarities between the first and second temples, the major difference in the two projects is that King Solomon possessed extreme wealth, while the returnees were operating on a grant from King Cyrus. Although the grant was charitable, it was limited. Solomon employed 153,000 workers, while the post-exilic community had a workforce of 15,000. When the community laid the temple foundations, they all came together to worship in song and prayer. Since the time of David, music was always a key part of sacrificial worship in Jerusalem. The people dedicated the temple project to God. Priests blew trumpets, the Levites clanged cymbals, and the congregation sang, "For he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever towards Israel." Their choice of songs seems a conscious effort once again to parallel the details of Solomon's temple. When Solomon dedicated the first temple, the people bowed down with their faces to the ground and sang the hymn of thanksgiving. The prophet Jeremiah foresaw a day after the end of exile that the people would repossess the desolate lands and bring offerings to Yahweh, singing this exact hymn. The words, "His steadfast love endures forever towards Israel," reminds the returned captives that their presence back in the land is evidence of God's faithfulness. When the foundations of the temple were complete, the people gathered as one, but their mixed emotions reflect a generational gap in their expectations. The elders had a high standard based on their former temple that the second temple could not possibly meet. To the contrary, the younger generation had no expectations. The younger generation spontaneously rejoiced with a great shout of praise to the Lord. Because those exiles were born in captivity, they had never witnessed a worship service dedicated to Yahweh. They had only imagined Jerusalem in their prayers, but had never walked its mountains or witnessed its sunset. When the priests lay their hands on the sacrificial lamb, confessing the sins of the community, the new generation must have felt for the first time the immense relief of unatoned sin being lifted. The older generation of priests, Levites, and family heads wept aloud at the gathering. Even though only the foundation of the temple was in view, they understood that the second temple paled in comparison to the former temple. The people who were disappointed in the project were all ones who had memories of Solomon's temple. Because the narrator of Ezra tries to keep the mood upbeat, he does not elaborate on the reason behind the elders' dissatisfaction. The prophet Haggai, chronicling the same moment in time, expounded more on the source of disappointment among the older returnees. Haggai asked, "Who is left among you who saw this house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Is it not in your sight as nothing?" The physical aspects of the second temple were not the only problem that the elders of the community perceived. A deep fear permeated the remnant that the Spirit of God might not return to Jerusalem. Ezekiel witnessed the departure of God's Spirit before Babylon conquered Jerusalem. The people awaited a sign that the glory of God had returned to dwell among them. At the dedications of both the tabernacle and Solomon's temple, the glory of God appeared to everyone present and supernaturally lit the altar fire. Ezra does not describe any such supernatural lighting or presence of God's glory at either the dedication for the altar or temple foundation. As spiritual people, they were looking for a visible sign of God's favor. If the manifestation of God's glory had not descended on the altar like in the days of Moses or Solomon, they wondered if that was an ominous sign for the future of the remnant. The post-exilic community will suffer many more disappointments over the next centuries. But this is their first wake-up call that even if their return to the land initiated God's redemptive plan, they were far from achieving the fullness of restoration. The rest of Ezra shows that the community still has work to do, inwardly and outwardly. Thank you for listening, and please continue to participate in this Bible reading challenge. Next week, we are reading Ezra 4. Tensions arise between the returnees and the local population. For all the biblical references each week, please see the show transcript on our blog or by signing up for our emails at thejerusalemconnection.us. I don't say all the references in the podcast, but they are all in the transcript. Send me a message and I'll respond. Bible Fiber is available on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. Shabbat Shalom.